Take a hard look at the rooms Elsie de Wolfe created. You think they're about light and elegance? Wrong. They were a declaration of independence, written in silken wood. Every light curtain that replaced heavy velvet drapes, every pale wall that banished dark wallpaper, that wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was an act of rebellion. She was fighting the suffocating grip of the Victorian era, not just in America's homes, but in her own life. She built spaces of freedom for others because she craved freedom more than anyone. Those rooms weren't her work. They were her, a secret language of liberation that only she and the woman she loved for 50 years could truly read. To understand the revolution that Elsie de Wolfe ignited, one must first feel the suffocating weight of the world she was born into. The year was 1865. The American Civil War had just ended, and the nation was plunging headlong into the Gilded Age, a period of explosive industrial growth and staggering new wealth. But this new money was housed in old ideas of taste. The Victorian interior was a fortress of gloom, a museum of morbid sentimentality. Rooms were choked with heavy, dark furniture carved into grotesque shapes. Windows were shrouded in layers of velvet and damask, blocking out the sun as if it were an intruder. Every surface was cluttered with bric-a-brac, taxidermied animals, and dour family portraits. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and gaslight. It was a style built on the principle of more fabric, more furniture, more objects, more shadow. This aesthetic was a reflection of the era's social mores, particularly for women. A woman's place was in the home, but the home was not her own. It was a patriarchal space, designed by men to display a husband's wealth and a wife's compliance. The ideal woman was the angel in the house, pious, pure, and utterly domestic. Her life was as corseted as her body, restricted by a rigid code of conduct that governed everything from how she spoke to whom she could visit. For a young woman of respectable, if not immense, means like Elsie, the path was brutally narrow. Make a good marriage. Her value was measured by her beauty, her dowry, and her ability to attract a suitable husband who would then provide for her, own her property, and dictate the course of her life. There was no concept of a respectable single woman having a career, let alone building an empire. The world was dark, cluttered, and rigidly defined. It was a world waiting for someone to come along and tear down the curtains. Having returned to America, not with the triumphant announcement of a noble engagement, but with the quiet, stinging humiliation of social failure, Elsie de Wolfe was faced with a stark and terrifying reality. The narrow, gilded path that society had laid out for her had crumbled before she had even taken her first few steps upon it. At 20 years old, she was, by the cruel calculus of her era, already a failure. A future as a spinster aunt, a dependent living on the charity of a more fortunate sibling, loomed as a grim and suffocating possibility. Marriage, the sole approved career for a woman of her class, was seemingly off the table. She therefore needed an alternative, a way to secure not just a livelihood, but an identity independent of a husband. In the late 19th century, the options for a gentlewoman in such a predicament were pitifully, insultingly few. She could become a governess, a lady's companion, or, if she had the connections, perhaps engage in some discreet charity work. All were paths to a life of quiet servitude and social invisibility, but Elsie craved visibility. She yearned for a stage. And so, in a decision that horrified her respectable family, she turned to the one, just one, profession that offered a sliver of audacious independence and a chance to be not just seen, but stared at: the theater. In 1890, Elsie de Wolfe embarked on a career as an actress. To modern sensibilities, this might seem like a glamorous choice, but in the Gilded Age, the stage was a world away from the drawing rooms of New York society. Acting was barely considered a respectable profession. It existed in a liminal space, somewhere between artistry and disrepute. Actresses were often viewed as women of loose morals. Their public displays of emotion and their transient bohemian lifestyles, placing them outside the rigid boundaries of polite society. For Dr. and Mrs. de Wolfe, their daughter's choice was a source of profound mortification, a public declaration of her failure to adhere to their world's unspoken rules. But for Elsie, it was a lifeline. It was a chance to earn her own money, to control her own destiny, and to step into the light on her own terms. She joined a touring company and began the arduous life of a working actress. By all accounts, she was never a truly great thespian. The critics who reviewed her performances were often lukewarm, praising her poise and presence, but finding her dramatic abilities lacking in genuine fire. She did not possess the raw, soul-bearing talent of an Eleonora Duse or the captivating charm of a Maud Adams. What she lacked in dramatic genius, however, she more than compensated for with something entirely new, something the American stage had rarely seen: sheer, unadulterated style. The stage became her first great laboratory for aesthetic experimentation. While other actresses were content with the often drab and ill-fitting costumes provided by the theater's wardrobe department, Elsie refused. She saw her roles not just as characters to be inhabited emotionally, but as canvases to be painted visually. With the money she was beginning to earn, and with a shrewd understanding of her own brand, she began insisting on commissioning her own gowns from the finest couturiers in Paris. Night after night, in theaters across the country, a strange phenomenon began to occur. Audiences, particularly the women, came not necessarily to be moved by Elsie's portrayal of a heartbroken heroine, but to gasp at what Elsie was wearing. She would sweep onto the stage in a creation by Worth or Paquin, a symphony of silk and lace cut with an elegance and modernity that made every other costume look dowdy and provincial. She became a walking, talking advertisement for a new kind of chic. Newspapers began reporting on her wardrobe as much as her performances. She was cultivating a public persona, learning that taste, when wielded with confidence, could be a formidable form of power. She was earning her own money, managing her own career, and discovering the thrill of financial independence. Her years on the stage were a crucible, teaching her practical lessons that would become the foundation of her future empire. She learned about the transformative power of lighting, about how to create a mood, how a backdrop could enhance or detract from the main subject, and how an environment, be it a stage set or a drawing room, could fundamentally shape an audience's perception and emotion. She was, in essence, decorating a scene long before she ever decorated a room. It was during this formative period, while she was still finding her footing in this slightly scandalous new world, that the single most significant event of her life occurred. In 1887, through mutual friends in New York's literary and theatrical circles, she met Elizabeth Bessie Marbury. Bessie Marbury was, in almost every conceivable way, Elsie de Wolfe's opposite. Where Elsie was cultivating an image of delicate feminine elegance, Bessie was stout, physically imposing, and unapologetically masculine in her dress and manner. She favored severely tailored suits, starched collars, and sensible shoes. She was plain-featured, with a direct, penetrating gaze that missed nothing. But what she lacked in conventional femininity, she possessed in raw intellectual firepower. Bessie was a formidable intellect and a brilliant, pioneering businesswoman. In an age when women were almost entirely excluded from the world of commerce, She had established herself as one of the most powerful literary and theatrical agents in the world. Her client list was a staggering roster of the era's greatest talents. She represented Oscar Wilde, handling the American productions of his plays. She championed George Bernard Shaw, fighting for his work to be seen on the New York stage. She managed the rights for J.M. Barrie, whose Peter Pan would become a global phenomenon. She was a shrewd negotiator, a legal mastermind, and a woman who moved with absolute confidence and authority in the male-dominated worlds of publishing and theater. Bessie was a powerhouse, a self-made woman who was wealthy, respected, and utterly, unshakably self-assured. The connection between the two women, the chic, ambitious actress and the brilliant butch agent, was immediate, electric, and profound. They saw in each other a reflection of their own unspoken needs. Elsie, with her society background and her exquisite taste, offered Bessie a key to a world of beauty, glamour, and social grace that she had never prioritized. Bessie, in turn, offered Elsie something far more valuable than any suitor ever could: intellectual heft, financial security, and unwavering, unconditional support for her nascent, unformed ambitions. They became inseparable, forming what was then discreetly known as a Boston marriage, a socially acceptable term for a long-term domestic cohabitation between two unmarried, financially independent women. In reality, their bond was a deep and committed romantic partnership that would become the central pillar of both their lives for over 4 decades. Together, they were a perfectly balanced and incredibly formidable power couple. Bessie provided the intellectual rigor and the business acumen, managing their finances with a shrewd eye and investing their money wisely. Elsie provided the aesthetic vision and the social connections. Their home in New York City became a celebrated salon, a gathering place for the brightest stars of the artistic, literary, and political worlds. On any given evening, one might find Oscar Wilde debating with a society grand dame or George Bernard Shaw arguing politics with a Wall Street titan. They navigated a society that had no name, no category for what they were. They were not sisters, not cousins, not simply companions. They were partners, a recognized unit, their lives interwoven personally, socially, and financially. Bessie's unwavering belief in Elsie's talent was the fertile ground in which Elsie's own genius could finally take root and flourish. With Bessie guarding her back, Elsie no longer had to worry about survival. She was free to create. Their shared life and Elsie's evolving aesthetic philosophy found its ultimate and most glorious expression across the Atlantic. In the early 1900s, around 1905, they, along with their close friend Anne Morgan, the fiercely independent daughter of the powerful financier J.P. Morgan, pooled their resources and purchased a property in Versailles, France. It was called the Villa Trianon. The house itself, a graceful neoclassical pavilion built in the late 18th century, had fallen into a state of picturesque decay. It was a dilapidated wreck, its gardens overgrown, its interiors dark, damp, and neglected for decades. But where others saw ruin, Elsie saw potential. She saw elegant bones beneath the grime, a classical harmony waiting to be rediscovered. Here, far from the prying, often judgmental eyes of New York society, she could create a world entirely of her own making, a sanctuary for herself and for the woman she loved. The restoration of the Villa Trianon became her obsession, her magnum opus. This was not a hobby. It was an all-consuming passion, the project for which her entire life had been a dress rehearsal. With Bessie's financial backing and Anne Morgan's enthusiastic support, Elsie poured her formidable energy into its rebirth. She approached the task with the strategic mind of a general and the soul of an artist. She ripped out the dark, heavy Victorian additions that had been made over the years. She knocked down walls, creating a sense of flow and openness between rooms. And then she brought in the light. She painted everything, walls, woodwork, ceilings, in shades of white, pale gray, and celadon green. She scoured the antique shops and auction houses of Europe, not for the heavy, ornate furniture she had grown up with, but for the light, graceful, and exquisitely proportioned French furniture of the 18th century. She favored pieces with clean lines, delicate carvings, and human scale, furniture that was meant to be used and enjoyed, not just admired from afar. She filled the rooms with mirrors, not out of vanity, but to capture and reflect every last ray of sunlight, to amplify the sense of space and to create a shimmering, ethereal quality. She famously brought the garden inside, installing entire walls of green and white trellis work to blur the line between the interior and the lush gardens she was simultaneously restoring outside. She filled the rooms with flowers, not in stiff, formal arrangements, but in casual, joyful bouquets. She upholstered chairs and sofas in cheerful floral chintz, a fabric that had been considered humble and countrified, but which she elevated to the height of sophistication. Most importantly, she arranged the furniture in a way that was, at the time, revolutionary. Instead of pushing it all back against the walls in a stiff, formal line, she created intimate, comfortable conversational groupings, encouraging social interaction rather than rigid formality. The Villa Trianon became her masterpiece, a living, breathing manifestation of her revolutionary aesthetic. It was a home designed for living, for comfort, for conversation, for light, and for joy. And it was their sanctuary, the one place on earth where her 40-year love affair with Bessie Marbury could exist in open, sunlit peace. The legend of Elsie de Wolfe's impeccable taste began to spread, whispered from one drawing room to another, carried across the Atlantic. Friends and acquaintances who visited the villa were stunned by its beauty and originality. They began to seek her advice for their own homes. The amateur actress, the failed debutante, was unknowingly on the cusp of inventing her true calling. The turning point came in 1905. A group of extraordinarily wealthy and powerful women, including Anne Morgan, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and Florence Daisy Harriman, had decided to create something unprecedented in America, an exclusive social club for women that would rival the grand, powerful clubs of their husbands and fathers. It was to be called the Colony Club. The commission for the building itself was given to the most prestigious architectural firm in the country, McKim, Mead, and White, with the legendary Stanford White himself overseeing the project. The exterior rose on Madison Avenue, a stately and impeccable example of Georgian revival architecture. But when it came to the interior, a crisis emerged. The male architects, brilliant as they were designing the spaces as if for a men's club. Their plans called for the familiar dark wood paneling, heavy leather armchairs, somber color palettes, and a general atmosphere of weighty, cigar-scented seriousness. The women of the club's board were horrified. This was not the vision they had for their sanctuary. They wanted something light, something elegant, something that reflected a modern feminine sensibility. They were at an impasse, struggling to articulate their desires to architects who simply could not see beyond the established conventions of club design. It was at this critical moment that Anne Morgan, who had spent countless hours in the sunlit rooms of the Villa Trianon, made a suggestion that was, by the standards of the day, utterly radical. "Why don't we hire Elsie?" she proposed. The suggestion was met with a stunned silence, followed by a flurry of debate. Hire Elsie de Wolfe, an actress, a socialite, with a knack for arranging furniture? The idea was audacious. There was, at the time, no such thing as a professional female interior decorator. It wasn't a job. It wasn't a category of employment. Decorating was a trade handled by upholsterers and furniture salesmen, men who took orders, not women who presented a cohesive artistic vision. To hand over the interior of such a high-profile and expensive project to an amateur, a woman, no less, was a tremendous gamble. But Anne Morgan was persistent, and the memory of the Villa Trianon was a powerful argument. The board, in a leap of faith that would change cultural history, agreed. Elsie de Wolfe was hired. She seized the opportunity with the ferocity of a starving woman presented with a feast. This was not just a job, it was the chance to prove her life's philosophy on the grandest possible stage. She arrived from Paris armed with sketches, fabric swatches, and a will of iron. She immediately clashed with Stanford White, a man accustomed to his genius being unquestioned. He dismissed her ideas as frivolous and impractical. She, in turn, saw his vision as a relic of a dead and gloomy past. But backed by her powerful female patrons, Elsie held her ground. She systematically dismantled the conventional wisdom of what a grand public space should be. She banished the dark wood paneling and heavy leather chairs. She vetoed the crimson velvets and the somber browns. Instead, she brought the revolution she had perfected at Versailles to the heart of Manhattan. She created a series of light, airy, and elegant spaces, each with its own distinct but harmonious character. Her masterstroke, the room that would be photographed and talked about for decades, was a stunning indoor garden room. She covered the walls in her signature green and white trellis work, creating the illusion of a sun-dappled French parterre. She filled the space with light, elegant wicker furniture, a material previously relegated to porches and verandas, and upholstered the cushions in bright, cheerful chintz. A small fountain gurgled in the center, its gentle sound replacing the funereal ticking of a grandfather clock. It was fresh, it was feminine, it was witty, and it was utterly transformative. In other rooms, she used pale gray and cream paint, hung simple glazed cotton curtains to let in the maximum amount of light, and chose graceful 18th century inspired furniture that encouraged conversation rather than stiff formality. She designed the members' private bedrooms to feel like rooms in a chic country house, not institutional cells. When the Colony Club officially opened its doors in 1907, it caused an absolute sensation. It was unlike anything New York society had ever seen. The press was rapturous. Visitors walked into the building and felt an immediate visceral sense of relief and delight. It was a space that felt optimistic, clean, and modern. Suddenly, every society woman in New York looked at her own Gilded Age mansion with its heavy curtains and cluttered rooms and saw it for what it was, a tomb. They all wanted a home that felt like the Colony Club. Elsie de Wolfe's career was launched, not like a ship, but like a rocket. Overnight, the demand for her services was overwhelming. It was in this moment that Elsie, with Bessie Marbury's shrewd business counsel, made her next brilliant move. She declared her acting career over and officially professionalized her talent. She opened an office on Fifth Avenue, hired a staff, and began charging substantial fees for her services. This was perhaps her most revolutionary act. She established the principle that taste, vision, and aesthetic expertise were valuable commodities, a professional service for which one should be paid. She was no longer a friend giving advice. She was the first American interior decorator. Her client list soon became a roll call of the wealthiest and most powerful families in America. The Vanderbilts, the Fricks, the Morgans, the Harrimans. She transformed their formidable but dreary Fifth Avenue palaces and Newport cottages into homes defined by light, comfort, and personal style. In 1913, she codified her philosophy in a hugely influential book, The House in Good Taste. The book, written in a clear, confident, and accessible style, was a declaration of war on the Victorian era. Its opening line became her credo, "I believe in plenty of optimism and white paint." She preached the gospel of simplicity, suitability, and beauty. She championed practical innovations like easy-to-clean surfaces and comfortable, well-proportioned furniture. She introduced her readers to the chicness of animal prints, which she called leopardine, the elegance of lacquer screens, and the importance of good lighting. The book was a phenomenal success, not just with her wealthy clients, but with a burgeoning middle class eager to bring style and modernity into their own homes. Elsie de Wolfe wasn't just selling decorating services. She was selling a new, optimistic, and fundamentally American way of life. Her life during these years was a whirlwind of success and glamour, a triumphant vindication after her early rejection. But her story was not to be one of uninterrupted frivolity. As her fame reached its zenith, the world was plunging into darkness. In 1914, the assassination of an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo ignited the flames of World War I. Elsie, then nearly 50 years old, and Bessie were in France at their beloved Villa Trianon. While many of their wealthy American compatriots fled the continent, Elsie refused to sit idly by. The woman who had dedicated her life to fighting ugliness was now confronted with the ultimate ugliness of industrial warfare. With a resolve that surprised many who knew her only as a purveyor of luxury, she volunteered as a nurse for the French Red Cross. She was stationed near the front lines in a hospital that specialized in treating the war's most horrific new casualties, men suffering from severe burns and the devastating effects of mustard gas attacks. This was a world away from chintz and champagne. It was a world of unimaginable pain, of screaming men, of the stench of burned flesh and antiseptic. Elsie, the apostle of beauty, waded into the heart of this horror. She worked tirelessly, cleaning wounds, changing dressings, and offering comfort to dying soldiers. Eyewitness accounts from the period describe her as preternaturally calm and efficient. Her famous discipline now applied not to yoga poses, but to the grim realities of triage. She used her own money to buy medical supplies and improve the squalid conditions of the hospital. Her work was so dedicated, so courageous, that the French government took notice. In recognition of her bravery and her service, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor, two of France's highest military and civil decorations. This period revealed a toughness, a grit, and a depth to her character that her carefully cultivated society reputation often obscured. She was not just a flighty tastemaker obsessed with appearances. She was a woman of immense substance, capable of facing the worst of humanity with unflinching courage. The war stripped away the artifice, and what lay beneath was a core of pure steel. The same will that had allowed her to impose beauty upon a room was now used to impose order and compassion upon chaos and suffering. She had proven that her life's work was not merely about creating beautiful surfaces, but about a profound and deeply held belief in the power of humanity to create light in the midst of darkness. When the guns of the Great War finally fell silent in 1918, a collective, ragged sigh of relief swept across the Western world. Europe was a landscape of ruins and ghosts. But for the survivors, there was an almost frantic, desperate desire to embrace life, to dance on the graves of the old world and its rigid pre-war certainties. The Roaring Twenties erupted not just as a decade, but as a cultural explosion, a fever dream of jazz flappers and champagne-fueled abandon. It was in this glittering, slightly hysterical new era that Elsie de Wolfe, now armed with the unimpeachable gravitas of a decorated war hero, ascended to her ultimate throne as the undisputed queen of international society and taste. She and Bessie Marbury returned to their beloved villa Trianon, which had miraculously survived the war unscathed. They threw themselves back into its life with a renewed vigor, transforming it from a private sanctuary into the most celebrated and sought-after salon in Europe. The post-war years at the villa were the zenith of their shared life. An invitation to one of Lady Mendl's parties, a title she did not yet possess but a role she was already playing, was the most coveted social prize of the decade. The guest list was a dazzling, eclectic mix of the old world and the new. Deposed European royalty mingled with Hollywood movie stars. Avant-garde artists like Jean Cocteau debated with conservative politicians, and American heiresses danced with penniless writers. Everyone who was anyone, or who desperately wanted to be, found their way to the gates of the villa. Elsie was the high priestess of these gatherings, a whirlwind of creative energy. She was a pioneer of the modern-themed party, orchestrating elaborate circuses, costume balls, and garden fetes with a theatrical flair honed during her years on the stage. She curated not just the guest lists and the menus, but the very atmosphere, ensuring that every detail, from the color of the lighting to the scent of the flowers, contributed to a perfect, harmonious whole. Bessie, as always, was the anchor, the quiet, formidable presence at the center of the storm, while Elsie, draped in shimmering gowns from Lanvin or Chanel, flitted among her guests. Bessie, clad in her customary tweed suit, would hold court in a corner, engaging in deep political debate or shrewdly negotiating a deal for one of her famous clients. They were a perfectly calibrated machine, the ultimate power couple presiding over a golden age. And so, in 1926, at the age of 61, Elsie de Wolfe made the most calculated, controversial, and for one person, the most unforgivable decision of her life. She announced her engagement to Sir Charles Mendl, a senior British diplomat. The arrangement was a cold transaction, a marriage blanc. Sir Charles, a homosexual man, needed the cover of a socially brilliant wife to advance in the rigid diplomatic corps. Elsie, in return, would gain the one thing she feared losing above all else, an unassailable social position and the title she would carry to her grave, Lady Mendl. For the world, it was gossip. For Bessie Marbury, it was an act of profound emotional violence. Elsie presented the marriage not as a discussion, but as a verdict. After 40 years as the bedrock of her life, the dominant partner in intellect and finance, the woman who had nurtured her genius, Bessie, was publicly demoted. Their partnership was declared insufficient. She was no longer a wife in all but name, but a companion, a historical footnote. The debate continues to this day. Was this a tragic but necessary act of self-preservation in a homophobic world that offered them no legal protection? Or was it the ultimate betrayal, a moment where Elsie, consumed by her fear of social irrelevance, sacrificed the heart of the one person who made her life beautiful? The answer may lie in the silence that followed. Friends described a heartbreaking coldness that descended upon the Villa Trianon. The easy intimacy was gone, replaced by a strained formality. Bessie, the woman who had faced down titans of industry, was broken. She began spending more time in America, putting an ocean between herself and the new Lady Mendl. Her health declined rapidly. Bessie Marbury died in 1933, 7 years after the wedding. Elsie had her title, Her fortress of respectability was secure, but she was now, and for the rest of her life, utterly alone. To truly know Elsie de Wolfe, one must be willing to look past the lacquered surfaces, the perfectly arranged bouquets, and the shimmering reflection in the antique mirrors. To understand the woman who became Lady Mendl is to understand that her entire life was a performance of breathtaking complexity and duration. But beneath the artifice, beneath the carefully constructed layers of chic and charm, was a wellspring of profound and turbulent emotion, born from the searing wound of early rejection and a desperate, lifelong need for absolute control. The society that had turned its back on her, that had casually branded her ugly and therefore worthless, had inadvertently created its own conqueror. In that moment of dismissal, an insatiable hunger was born in her, a hunger not just to appreciate beauty, but to own it, to define it, to become its ultimate arbiter. Her career was not merely a profession, it was a form of magnificent, exquisitely planned revenge. She once remarked in a moment of candid self-assessment, "I am going to make everything around me beautiful. That will be my life." This was not the flippant declaration of a society decorator. It was the solemn, unshakable creed of a survivor. Every room she designed, every party she threw, every detail of her own appearance was a meticulously placed stone in the fortress she built around herself, a fortress designed to keep the ugliness of the world and the memory of her own perceived ugliness at bay. Each victory of taste was a victory over the indifferent queen and the whispering courtiers, a testament to her triumph over the limitations they had tried to impose upon her. The emotional core of this life, the furnace that powered her creative ambitions for 4 decades, was her relationship with Bessie Marbury. It is impossible to understand Elsie without understanding the depth and complexity of this partnership. Eyewitness accounts, letters, and memoirs from their contemporaries paint a vivid picture of a bond built on deep complementary affection and rock-solid mutual respect. The writer and gourmand Ludwig Bemelmans, a frequent guest at the Villa Trianon, described a household that revolved around their comfortable, established dynamic. He painted a picture of Bessie, often dressed in a severe but perfectly tailored tweed suit, managing a global business empire from a cluttered desk, fielding cables from producers and authors, her mind a sharp, analytical machine. At the same time, Elsie, a vision in a floating chiffon tea gown, would be orchestrating the day's beauty, debating the precise placement of a newly acquired vase, or composing the menu for that evening's dinner, with the seriousness of a composer writing a symphony. They were, as one friend dubbed them, the bachelor ladies, a unit as solid, as recognized, and as permanent in their social circle as any married couple. Their domesticity was built on decades of shared history and intimate knowledge of one another's needs and comforts. Friends recalled Elsie's complete and unwavering devotion to Bessie's physical comfort, a tenderness that belied her own steely exterior. She would ensure Bessie's favorite armchair was always perfectly positioned by the fire, that her meals were prepared exactly to her liking, and that her work was never disturbed. Bessie, in turn, provided the intellectual sparring and the unquestioning emotional support that Elsie, for all her social confidence, desperately needed. She was Elsie's first and most important audience, the one person whose approval truly mattered. Theirs was a love story written not in passionate sonnets, but in the steady prose of a shared life, a partnership that was both a romantic and a strategic alliance of formidable power. Elsie's own legendary eccentricities provide another crucial window into her psychology. Her obsession with physical fitness, for example, was decades ahead of its time and deeply unusual for a woman of her era and class. While other Society hostesses languished on chaiselongs. Elsie practiced yoga daily. She famously stood on her head for several minutes each morning, a ritual she claimed was essential to get the blood to her brain and maintain her youthful complexion. She was a devoted teetotaler in an age awash with cocktails and champagne, and a near vegetarian who believed that a disciplined diet was the key to vitality. This rigid, almost monastic discipline was another manifestation of her core need for control. She could not stop the aging process entirely, but she could fight it with every fiber of her being. She could impose her will on her own body, refusing to let it succumb to the natural processes of decay, which she viewed as just another form of ugliness. The headstand in the photograph was not a party trick. It was a daily act of war against time. Her famous blue-rinsed hair was part of this same battle. When her naturally dark hair began to turn a dull, lifeless gray, she refused to accept it. She experimented for months with different vegetable rinses and tints, seeking not to restore her original color, but to create something new, something better. She finally found a formula that gave her hair a delicate, ethereal blue-white tint, a color she had admired on the powdered wigs of the elegant marquises in 18th century Fragonard portraits. It was entirely unnatural, completely artificial, and utterly arrestingly chic. It became her trademark, a perfect symbol of her core philosophy. One need not accept the hand that nature deals. One could and indeed should improve upon it through artifice, taste, and will. One of the most revealing anecdotes of her relentless pursuit of aesthetic control comes from her time in Hollywood. When France fell to the Nazis in 1940, she and Charles fled their beloved Paris. In her late 70s, she relocated to Beverly Hills and, with undiminished energy, bought a house she named after all. She immediately set about recreating her Versailles world in the California sunshine, establishing a new salon that quickly became the epicenter of Hollywood society. At one of her legendary parties, the guest of honor was the Duchess of Windsor, Wallis Simpson. To mark the occasion, Elsie issued a secret order to her staff. The water in a decorative pool in her garden was to be dyed the precise shade of blue as the Duchess's famous eyes. This small, wildly extravagant gesture speaks volumes. It was a demonstration of absolute power over her environment, a world where even nature itself could be bent to her will for the sake of a beautiful, fleeting moment. But it was also a world that required constant, exhausting vigilance. The writer Gore Vidal, who encountered her in her later years, hinted at the profound loneliness that lay beneath the glittering, perfectly composed facade. She was always on, perpetually performing the role of Lady Mendl. The price of inventing herself was the quiet, gnawing terror that the real Elsie, the plain, awkward, ugly girl from New York, might one day be discovered underneath it all. Her life was a dazzling creation, a masterpiece of public relations and personal branding. But like any great and complex work of art, it was born from a place of deep, undeniable, and exquisitely human vulnerability. A darker and far more troubling controversy surrounds Elsie's political leanings, or lack thereof, in the catastrophic run-up to the Second World War. During the 1930s, while living in Paris, she and Charles Mendl moved in the most elite social circles, a world that unfortunately included influential Nazi sympathizers and high-ranking German officials. Most notoriously, she was known to be friendly with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi ambassador to Britain, and later Hitler's fanatically loyal foreign minister. Her meticulously recorded social calendar included parties, dinners, and weekend gatherings attended by figures who were, at that very moment, actively orchestrating the dismemberment of democracy and the persecution of Europe's Jews. After the shocking fall of France in 1940, she and Charles were able to secure exit visas from the Nazi-controlled territory with a relative ease that has raised eyebrows ever since, a privilege not afforded to countless others, particularly those of Jewish descent who were desperately trying to flee the coming storm. This has led to persistent and serious accusations that Elsie was, at best, criminally naive and willfully blind, and at worst, a Nazi sympathizer or even a low-level collaborator. The evidence, while circumstantial, is damning. The diaries of her contemporaries contain troubling allegations. The influential British socialite and diarist Henry Trianon, for example, noted in his diary that Elsie was decidedly pro-German. Other accounts allege she made casual, snobbish, and anti-Semitic remarks in private conversation. While she never made any public pro-Nazi statements, her enthusiastic willingness to socialize with and entertain key members of the murderous regime has cast a long, dark cloud over her legacy. The historical debate centers on interpretation and intent. Were her actions simply those of a pragmatic, apolitical hostess, a woman so obsessed with her own social standing that she was oblivious to the monstrous evil of her guests? Was she simply maintaining her position at the center of European society, blind to the moral implications of whose champagne she was pouring? Or did she harbor genuine sympathies for the fascist cause, prioritizing her luxurious lifestyle and her aristocratic connections above any moral or political convictions? There is no definitive smoking gun answer, but the evidence of her associations is undeniable and deeply unsettling. It profoundly complicates the triumphant narrative of a woman who brought light and air into the world. It suggests that while she was illuminating her drawing rooms, she was willing to turn a blind eye to the profound and absolute darkness that was gathering to consume Europe. This complexity forces a painful reevaluation of her entire project of self-invention. Elsie de Wolfe crafted a persona of elegance, beauty, and unimpeachable good taste. The historical record, however, suggests that this persona may have been maintained through a series of profound moral and personal compromises. She created a beautiful, hermetically sealed bubble for herself, first at the Villa Trianon and later in Beverly Hills. But the world outside that bubble was descending into chaos, horror, and genocide. The unresolved debate over her wartime conduct challenges us to ask difficult questions about the responsibility of artists, tastemakers, and cultural figures in times of political crisis. Is it enough to simply make everything beautiful when the world outside is burning? Or does the relentless pursuit of beauty at all costs, divorced from a moral compass, become a form of profound moral abdication? These unresolved controversies ensure that Elsie de Wolfe remains a fascinating, essential, and deeply flawed figure, a woman whose polished, lacquered surfaces cannot entirely conceal the complex and sometimes troubling history that lies just beneath. And yet, despite these shadows, her tangible impact remains monumental. Her most revolutionary achievement was the creation of an entirely new industry, professional interior design. Before Elsie, decorating was the purview of upholsterers, furniture salesmen, or architects, tradesmen, not artists. Wealthy women might have opinions about their homes, but they did not have a career in shaping them. Elsie de Wolfe changed all of that by hanging out a shingle, opening an office, publishing a book, and charging handsomely for her taste and expertise. She professionalized the field. She established that the creation of a home's interior was a skill, an art form worthy of respect, and crucially, remuneration. In doing so, She opened a door through which generations of women and men could pass, allowing them to build careers based on their creativity and aesthetic vision. Every interior designer who drafts a floor plan or chooses a fabric swatch today owes a foundational debt to the audacious actress turned tastemaker who first had the nerve to bill a client for her ideas. Her aesthetic revolution was just as profound and enduring. We live today in an Elsie de Wolfe world, though we may not know it. Her militant rejection of Victorian gloom in favor of light, air, and simplicity became the dominant aesthetic of the 20th century and continues to shape our most cherished ideals of what a home should be. The modern preference for uncluttered spaces, for light-colored walls that maximize sunlight, for comfortable and functional furniture, and for the seamless integration of indoor and outdoor living can all be traced directly back to the principles she first championed at the Colony Club and perfected at the Villa Trianon. When she famously declared, "I opened the doors and windows of America and let the air and sunshine in," it was not an arrogant boast. It was a simple statement of fact. She fundamentally altered the psychological relationship people had with their living spaces, transforming the home from a dark, formal museum for displaying wealth into a bright, personal sanctuary for the messy, joyful act of living. Ultimately, Elsie de Wolfe's story matters because it is a story about the radical, difficult, and sometimes painful act of self-creation. She was a woman who was told by the world that she had little value. She was not pretty enough to marry well, not talented enough to be a great actress. She responded not by accepting this verdict, but by rebuilding the world around her to reflect her own singular vision. She took the raw, unpromising materials of her life, rejection, ambition, a preternaturally keen eye, and an iron will, and from them, she constructed an identity far grander and more influential than anyone could ever have imagined for her. She teaches us that our environments shape us, but that we, in turn, have the power to shape our environments. Her life is a testament to the idea that beauty is not a frivolous luxury, but a vital, life-sustaining force, a tool for creating order and joy in a chaotic world. The most profound design project any of us will ever undertake is the design of our own lives. In the end, what remains of Elsie de Wolfe is more than just a style or a name. It is the enduring power of a singular, defiant vision. She stepped onto a world stage that was dark, cluttered, and suffocating, and with an almost ruthless determination, she filled it with light. Her life was a study in breathtaking contrasts. The public revolutionary who guarded a private, unconventional love, the apostle of simplicity who lived a life of extravagant artifice, the icon of elegance whose legacy is forever touched by moral ambiguity. She was not a simple hero. She was ambitious, at times ruthless, and her choices were often born from a cold pragmatism that could wound those closest to her. Yet to dismiss her for her flaws is to miss the greater, more resonant truth of her existence. She was a woman who refused to be defined by the limitations placed upon her, by her gender, by her plainness, by the rigid, unforgiving rules of her time. When society offered her no acceptable path, she carved out her own with impeccable style and an unbreakable will. She reminds us that the spaces we inhabit are not passive backdrops. They are active participants in our lives with the power to either oppress us or to liberate us. Perhaps the most lasting lesson from the complex life of Lady Mendl is that the quest for beauty is, at its heart, a quest for control. By perfecting a room, by arranging flowers in a vase, by choosing the perfect shade of paint, she was imposing a fragile but beautiful order on her universe. She lived a life that was a work of art, a dazzling, complex, and sometimes contradictory composition. And like all great art, it continues to challenge us, to inspire us, and to make us see the world and the rooms we call home in a new and much brighter light.